You put a Google.
It's just going to crash everything.
It won't crash everything.
That thing barely works.
Do you want me to Google Hangout it?
No.
I don't have anyone to invite, so there's no point. Go ahead.
That's fine. All right, ready? Excellent. So, Sencha Touch in practice is the title of my presentation, as you can see. So, first of all, what is it? Sencha Touch is an all-in-one HTML5 based mobile development framework. So it's for making mobile apps completely within its own ecosystem, or you can use just little pieces of it, but it's designed to work within itself. All its components are designed to work together very smoothly, and they do. So you can use it as a piece, you can use it as the front end, you can use it as the back end. Either way, you could, but it works best altogether. So it does quite a bit of things. It has native, easily themable look and feel, plenty of native feature integration. You can do calendar, Bluetooth, contacts, whatever, all that normal stuff. And you can do that either with Sencha's built-in, they have their own built-in library for it, or you can, they have built-in adapters to PhoneGap, so you can use PhoneGap's implementation through Sencha Touch, like really seamlessly. It works really well. The other thing is it's very easy to make event-driven apps, which is just outstanding. Making everything event-driven is wonderful, and you just you throw coupling just straight out the window when that occurs. And its layout engine, while very powerful, can become very non-performant if you're not careful. So you can be very careful. You want to, generally speaking, with pure JavaScript, CSS, mobile apps, you want to keep the DOM as thin as you possibly can. You want to keep your CSS as simple as you possibly can. There's a few specific pain points on mobile Safari, which are not important, but they involve some of the more complex CSS things. And it also comes with a wonderful suite of view widgets and also charts. So, as far as architecture, it is really what I like to call MVCS, Model View Controller Store. So, in your typical MVC model, your model handles all the data storage as well. So it'll point to some backend or other, which in Sencha doesn't really work the best, because in a mobile app you don't have a constant connection to your backend necessarily. So what you have is a store, which is a local cache, and I'll explain that a little more in a minute. So basically, you attach your model to your store, and the model handles the collections instead. And as I was talking about, it's a very self-contained model, and really works best altogether. And finally, SASS, Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. It's the best tool in the universe, and I will show you exactly why that is later. And finally, it's very easy to deploy natively. It's 5 minutes work. All right. So, as a companion to Sencha Touch, there's also the Sencha SDK tools, which come with a few, which are command line based, and they come with there are basically two things you really want to do with the Sencha tools. First thing is generate your app skeleton. So basically what that will do is that will give you a bare bones structure for your application. It'll give you the folder structure that you're supposed to use, will give you a launch point, and get you a bare bones blank app basically run in just 1 second. And I've listed all the configuration options. You can peruse those at your leisure. And the number 2 and most important thing it does is minification. So Sencha's SDK minification tool is really, really great, because you configure your app dependencies within the Sencha framework, and it will pull those in and attempt to rip out as much as it possibly can. So you give it a big directory to slurp in JavaScript and everything. Slurp in all your JavaScript, and it will analyze all of that, rip out bits of the Sencha, rip out any piece of Sencha Touch that you are not using, and just throw it out before minification. So it's dependency analysis and minification all in one tool. It's fantastic. So you're definitely going to want to include that in your production build process at some point. So here's your basic project spreadsheet for Sencha Touch. You have your top level app directory, and that's where all your app code goes, obviously. There are a bunch of subfolders for each type of thing. Generally, they have you can do whatever you want beneath them, but throughout your code base, there are a few special configuration parameters that assume the existence of some of these folders, which I'll get into later. But generally speaking, you can organize it however you want and use absolute paths for whatever files you have to include. So up to you. And down here is your resources folder, which contains all your static stuff, CSS, etc. With Sencha Touch, you have pretty much one CSS file. It's called app.css, generated by Sass. So you never want to edit this file because it'll just get deleted next time you compile your Sass into CSS. And then below that, we have a Sass folder with your app.scss. And I'll get into all the fun things you can do with that later. So we have here the core of your app right here in these 4 files. So index.html, obviously what the web browser goes to in order to start. And that basically contains just like a tiny bit of bootstrap JavaScript, which will essentially launch app.js and get all that stuff rolling. App.json is where you define your application dependencies. Any external JavaScript or CSS you can define here. It will be pulled in with the build, as described before. And then you have .sencha SDK, which is a super secret file that isn't really documented, but is incredibly useful if you want to put your Sencha library that you use with this project somewhere else than the default folder, which by default is SDK right at the top level. There's a folder named SDK right at the same level as app. So if you want to put that in, say, live Sencha or something, all you have to do is change the path in this little bit, and then all the Sencha tools will still work. So the first thing you do to create an Sencha Touch application is define it with ext.application. And this is basically what your app.js file contains. And what it does is it starts your application and fires up the initial view. So you specify, in app.js, it's generally very thin. You specify things that you need globally, like for example your application models, stores. You can include those all in app.js and they'll just kind of be available to the rest of your application. You don't want to put everything in there because it'll get very cluttered, and you can put the view dependencies in the other files, which I'll get to later. And so it accepts one argument, which is an object that defines your application. And that's very generic, but basically what it means is it's just a JavaScript object with a bunch of keys that map to a bunch of values. And
So
then
it has to be an object or a floater? Or
No, it's an object it's just a list of properties, name, values.
Gotcha.
standard JavaScript key value object, which is pretty much how everything in Sencha Touch works. So, and then one of those will be the launch property. And attached to this launch property is a function which is called once app.js is ready, has gotten all its dependencies going, and it's ready to start. Then it calls launch. And this is the part where you start your app. So you will tell it to launch this view or do any kind of startup you need to do to bootstrap your application and then get rolling. This is the startup point right here. And then the other especially useful one is the name property. So that is the name of your application. You can reference that easily from anywhere within the code base. So if you need to, attach your title to a bunch of pop-ups or whatever, you just reference that. It's all in one spot. Great, no duplication. Excellent. So here's kind of what it looks like. And so everything is in the ext namespace. So this is pretty much the entire file right here. So it's got one block of code, ext.application. And that is a function call, and here is your object. Here's your configuration object right here. And there's our name property. We defined This is a views property. I mentioned before that some of the properties assume the existence of the project structure. This will look for a file called main.js in your views folder. So at views main.js, it'll automatically try to interpret this main as at views main.js. So it's very convention-y over configuration, a la Rails. And here is our launch function, which is very simply creating a view right here and adding it to the viewport. So Sencha Touch has this default viewport object that exists and you can use for your convenience. But basically it's just the full screen window of your app. And you can stick any views you want in there and it's good to go. It's good to put things there that you're going to use globally. Whether or not you define them here, you can find them elsewhere and attach them to the viewport. It's all fine. Or you can build your own custom viewport if you're going to have things in it. That's probably a better plan. And then of course you'd add your own viewport to the ext viewport, and then you just add things to your own viewport. Yes, Dan.
Just as a side note about viewport, the viewport is what allows it to automatically resize and change things inside of the application. So if you don't use a viewport, it doesn't work right in general, my experience. So if you were to take and create your view and you just added it to the body, for instance, you could because that if you get into this, all these things can be sort of pointed at a particular thing. If you don't use the viewport, the viewport actually does a whole bunch of other stuff. So you need to use the viewport pretty much. And especially for Sencha Touch, I don't know what you would do if you didn't use it. It would probably just explode, and you'd have to implement a lot of stuff manually.
It might explode. In fact. So there we go. This is our application bootstrap. So we move on to ext.define, and this is how we do literally everything else.
Except that.
Except the initial thing, which is ext application. But every other model, store, view, controller, whatever, will all be created and initialized with ext.define. So, like I said here, the first code line of every file, and just everything. This is how you do everything within Sencha Touch. So it's especially useful for namespacing, and that's really the only way to do namespacing within Sencha Touch is to create namespacing as the first argument of ext.define, which I'll show you an example of in just a second. So it's got 3 arguments. First is required, which is the name, the fully qualified class name, so that would be whatever that is. So if you're making a view, it would be your app.views. Whatever view you are creating. So this name is the fully qualified name, and the definition object, which I will go over in a minute, but it's very similar to the application definition object, except it's called config, and it has a config section in it, which is very special all by itself. And then the third argument is an optional function, which will be called after this is initialized. After the class is defined and pulled into the application and ready to be used, this function will be called. So it's useful to add it to any kind of singleton managers you have laying around. It's like, all right, this class has been pulled into memory, ready to use, and then you can notify something that has occurred. And that's generally what you use that for.
When I just have questions, just to make sure I actually understand what this slide means. When you have a chance. Yes.
Okay,
Go ahead. That name thing, is that like the namespace and class name?
Yes.
Okay, so just automatically creates that, and then you just reference that.
Let me show you the example. It probably helpful. So here, ext.define, it's just another function. The first argument is a string, which is your fully qualified class name. So here is our namespace, st2demo.view, and this is our class name at the end here. So standard fully qualified name. Everyone knows what this looks like. And then generally you will be extending some ext component. So there's really not a whole lot of reason to not do that.
Now this stuff is ext.js components?
Yes.
Sencha touch components.
Yeah,
They share
different, yeah.
a lot, but they are not identical.
No.
So I'm not actually using HTJS. I'm using
No,
You're
you're
using
not using
Sencha touch.
EXTJS. You're
It,
using
share,
Sencha touch.
it shares
It's
a lot
common,
of design
but not
ideas. Yes,
Yes.
it's very similar. If you know HTTPS, you'll be able to pick this up in just no time.
Yeah, and just to be clear, this is all pure JavaScript. It's just that Sencha has implemented a class system in JavaScript that allows, mostly for the sake of Java developers, frankly, to be able to understand this. So you're given familiar semantics so that you can see what's going on without having to necessarily understand JavaScript's prototypal inheritance pattern.
All right, and so yes, basically what you have here is Sencha has a basic, more or less fully fledged object model, and you can do everything you'd be able to do in any normal object-oriented language. That's really quite awesome. Including, it's got some extra features such as aliasing. So this thing is called an X-type. An X-type is the Sencha word for what I want to call this. It's just an alias. It's a short name for something. So you can reference this in other views or whatever by its X-type instead of its full name. So you can omit this if you like and just use the fully qualified name everywhere if that suits your fancy. Otherwise, you can use the X-type and use that everywhere, whichever you prefer.
Can I make one more comment? I'm sorry. The X-type's really useful because in JavaScript, if you specify a class name directly, and that is not available at the time that file is processed, it throws an error and breaks. So the aliasing allows you to lazily define and specify classes in files way down here somewhere, and have those things be interpreted in the correct dependency order when that stuff is resolved. So I think that's really one of the more powerful things about the aliasing.
Well, Sencha Touch does that a little differently.
Yeah.
If the X-type doesn't implicitly include anything, you still have to.
No. It doesn't include anything.
Okay.
I'm not saying it does. I'm just saying that because it's a string, if it wasn't a string and you put ext.tab.panel without the quotes, if ext.tab.panel wasn't available, it would break. But because you're using a string, it can, if you have the dynamic dependency resolution enabled, it can resolve it. And even if it isn't resolving it at the time, it allows the build tool to resolve the dependencies in the correct order.
Indeed it does.
When it's built.
And then finally down here we have our magical config object. This, as I will get into, is the heart and soul of Sencha Touch. Along with ext define and config. They are BFFs. Do not ever use them apart from each other. Click. Yes. And here we go, the config object. So the config object is the thing in an ext define call. So basically anything, any property you can set, any configuration you can do, any custom properties you want to add to a class go inside the config object. And any helper methods that you want the class to have go outside the config object. So as you can see here, I have a function which calls another function which ends up logging the word kittens console, because every console needs more kittens.
Yes.
So I'll go straight to the example because that's much more helpful. And so here we have our same thing from the previous view, except now our config object block has data in it. So this happens to be the config for an ext.tab.panel. As you might guess, that is a tab panel. So right here we have one configuration option for the tab panel, the tab bar position, which is on the bottom. So essentially allows you to have tabs on the top or tabs on the bottom, whichever you prefer. This one, I happen to like bottom because you can put cool icons on them and it looks good. And then the other thing that you will almost always use within the config object is the items property. So the items property is an array of every child element of this thing. So in this case, we have a view. So this would be all of the child components that go with this view would be listed in the items. And you can see I'm referencing, so here's the first item in the view, and it is a title bar. So I've referenced it by X-type, title bar. That's built into Sencha Touch. They've already defined an X-type for their title bar class as title bar. So you just kind of use that, and then docked to the top. And that's an HTML5 feature which docks things the sides of windows. and then set the title to our app name using our handy dandy global reference to our application. And then below that, we have another item. However, it's not entirely obvious what this is because there's no X type or any other indication of what it might be. There's just a title and an icon. However, since we've extended, this is Sencha tries to do as much implicitly as it can. So since we're using a tab panel, it will assume that any item you specify is a tab, is a definition for a tab. And you'll see this theme throughout a lot of the components. It will assume things about what you do unless you specify otherwise. So here we go. We've defined a single tab button with the title of home and a home icon. And the result is a screen which looks more or less like this. So we have our title at the top, and we have our home tab at the bottom, and we have absolutely nothing in the middle because we gave it no information about that. But in, say, 20 lines of code, you now have a complete working application with a tab panel and a native-looking UI. So thumbs up, we're doing good. And now to get into the nitty-gritty architecture of the thing, now you got the kind of an idea how it works. Go back. So, models. Models are probably the most important. So anytime, if you're working with any kind of data source, that is. So models define the structure of data. They contain model-specific logic, and they work entirely within themselves in good MVC practice. So what models have primarily are a few things. They have fields, they can validate, and they can have associations. So fields, obviously, are the data fields which are coming through in the data which you want the model to represent. So fields are defined as objects, and the objects have a number of properties. So they have a name property, which is what it maps to in the data. So if you're consuming JSON, this would be the name of the JSON property, which maps to the bit of data you want it to shove into the model. And the type is an expected data type, and it doesn't really do a whole lot because it's JavaScript, which doesn't have a whole lot of typing, as you might be aware, but it's helpful for a few things within Sencha, including like automatic formatting and things like that. But generally, not all that important.
Dates.
Dates, yes.
Very useful for dates.
Very useful for dates. That's a good example. So, and they also have a mapping. So if your data contains some silly properties that are named ridiculous things that you can't change because you don't own the server, then you can alias them to whatever you want within your application. So if something is named some misspelled gobbledygook, then you can name it to nicely named, properly spelled property and use that within your app instead of the garbage Mr. Random Server Developer has given to you. So that's very handy, like that. And then we have a default value, which is an optional default value. In fact, all of these fields are optional except for name. That's the only one we need. That should say optional right there. But, and moving on to validations. So you can validate on a number of things, from simple existence to regexes to whatever the heck you want. There's a half a dozen validations which you can attach to your fields, and anytime something happens, it will validate and then take whatever response you deem as appropriate if that validation succeeds or fails. And then associations is the fun part. So it can do both many-to-one, one-to-one, and many-to-one relationships between models and that. And once you get, it's a little tricky to get rolling, but if you have some complex data and you get the models and their associations just right, it takes zero work to consume that complex data. So all the work for consuming data with Sencha is really in setting up your object model and not in the actual consumption of it. Consuming data is trivial. Turning it into objects is much less trivial, which is kind of not what I was used to, because that's the other way around in a lot of other places. Because you have to do no work with netcode. It just works because it's in a browser. It's what the browser does. I mean, So there's that advantage going for it. So you don't have to focus on any of that stuff. You can just focus on your app and the data it needs to do. It needs to do it. So here's an example, and this is a model for a tweet. And if you notice, we're extending ext.data.model. So all of our models will extend this class, and then it can be used as a Sencha touch model. And then we have one, and let's pay close attention to this little guy here, requires. So the requires statement can go inside of any ext defined block, and that will look for a file by its fully qualified name. So this will look for twitter.js in the folder sd2demo/proxy/twitter.js. So that's what that's looking for. Same kind of deal as the original before, except you can include any arbitrary thing you need. So if you need an external whatever the heck, if you want jQuery, if you want some data formatting library or whatever, you can include that right here or earlier in your application, and as long as it's there, you're good to go.
I'm going to point out two really quick. So requires you, I've said that dynamic dependency resolution, ext or Sencha Touch will do dynamic or not dynamic dependency resolution. Usually for development you use dynamic, and so it would try to load that file, right? If you're in a production mode or you're building a production artifact, the build tool will read the require statement and include that file at a point before this file so that it will resolve correctly.
Yes.
So that's how it works, and those periods are slashes in general. You can modify how the dependency resolver interprets those strings, but by default it would be exactly what you said.
And this can also be an array of strings if you need more than one requires. So lots of things can do that in Sencha. It can either take single string argument or an array. So if you feel like you might need more than one thing, try turning it into an array and see if it works, because it just might. And then we have our config object, under which we have a number of fields. Now these aren't very important. These are just what the Twitter search API happens to use as data fields, which is what I've used for the demo app. And but you see they're each an object with a name property and a type property. Except for these guys, who just have a name, because we don't care about what type they are. And that's all very straightforward. So it will attempt to pull all of your data out and map them using these fields.
Out of curiosity, what happens if there's fields that come in that are not explicitly defined?
It will ignore them.
I won't even put them on the model.
You have to explicitly define all your fields.
Well, you can still access them.
Right.
When you pull when this model gets stored, it becomes a record object, and a record object also contains the raw data from which the parsed model is based on. So you can get to the raw data if you need to. Generally, you should never have to do that, but it is there.
You can also use set fields on the prototype of this instead of if you when you build a model, you can instantiate it, right? So you instantiate the model, and at that point it has data in it, has raw data, which is parsed into this thing, so you get this, it fills in the blanks, right? You can also use the model manager to grab the model and modify the prototype to include dynamic fields. So if you can get them back, if you intercept the process of getting the JSON back, you spin through it, grab your extra fields somehow, you can modify the prototype of this to include those extra fields, and then it will work just like it does. It's just as if you had typed them in manually.
That brings up an interesting thing. Just about every property that's inside of the config property will have an associated getter-setter method that's automatically created by the Sencha framework. So even if you invent your own stuff, like if I made a field called kittens, it would generate a getter and setter called getKittens, for me, which is awesome. I like that. So since every model has a fields object, every model also has a setFields getField method. So which you can call from within the code base and alter everything at your whim.
And you can use,
is that a snake case?
No, camel case.
Camel case.
Lower camel case specifically.
Right.
Not upper camel case like some .NET frameworks I might not. Anyway, And down here is a proxy. And a proxy, in short, retrieves data from somewhere. Walter, you should click the button. Why did that go to sleep?
It's perfecting the image. Please wait.
Oh, that's cute.
It's going to be perfect.
Alright. And a proxy you can either define here, or you can define, here I've defined my own custom proxy type, and I'll go into how to do that. But you can also use one of the built-in types, which I'll also get into later. But for now, this retrieves data from stuff.
Whoa.
Okay.
Yeah, just so you know about that thing, it goes to sleep after 30 seconds. So you click once, it'll wake up. Click again, it'll go.
Got it. Here I am. Excellent. So now stores. Stores very simply are collections of models. That's more or less all they do. They can filter the collection, they can group the collection, they can do all the kinds of things you'd expect a collection of objects to do. It can sort the collection. And it can store it in a number of places. You can store it in browser local storage, which will persist between sessions. You can store it in browser session storage, which will be cleared every time the browser closes, in which case this means every time you close your mobile app, this session storage will be cleared. And the default type is memory storage, which just kind of stores it in a block of memory somewhere. And it goes away as soon as no one's using it anymore. So what's very important to know is that stores are not resilient storage that you should use. They are a local cache. You should not ever attempt to save any kind of, useful data in a store. You should save that somewhere else with resilient storage, like a database backend or some other thing, or like a database on device, which you can use through PhoneGap or what have you. But stores are not where you store things that you need to keep forever. There's things where you need to store things that are really nice to have now. And it pulls data from its proxy or from static data, which you can configure within the store config object. So either dynamic or static, whichever you prefer. And of course, built-in filtering, sorting, and grouping. You can do a whole lot of customization on that front, which is probably a talk by itself. So here's what a simple store looks like, and you notice it's almost no code at all. We extend ext.data.store, and that makes it a store. We require our model, std model.tweet, and we tell it that that's the model we want to use for this store. And that's it. That's all we have to do. We now have a store that will store collections of tweets. And here we go, views. So views present data, and a good view is as dumb as rocks. A view should not do anything if you can help it. I mean, if it is doing things completely contained within itself, that's cool. If it's doing anything remotely complex, put it somewhere else, because it'll just cause you pain. So, I may have touched on the Sencha component model, but it's very like just about every UI toolkit out there. There's a Java Swing. Everything is based off of the JComponent class. And here in Sencha, they also have a Sencha component, ext.component, which is what all things inherit from. So all things that can contain other objects inherit from ext.container, which inherits from ext.component. And then with views, there's really two important things you have to know about views, and the rest is completely app specific. So the first thing is layouts. So Sencha has a number of built-in layouts, the most important of which are fit, hbox, vbox, and car. So fit just fills its parent container to the best of its ability. Very simple. The hbox arranges items horizontally, and you can specify in configuration exactly how horizontal you want each object to be using the flex parameter. So this uses the WebKit flexbox, which is super great and basically throws tables right out the window. So the WebKit, the flexbox model is much more powerful and you'll never have to web develop with tables ever again. And vbox is exactly like hbox, except it stacks things vertically. So You can generally nest these together to create more complex layouts, but you do not want to nest them too deeply or else you will experience severe performance problems. So you have to be very careful with how you design your UI. And if you're getting 6 or 7 levels deep, you may want to evaluate if your UI might need some revising. Because remember guys, this is a mobile app. People have to touch it and do stuff with it.
I have nothing. Man, it's really easy to overnest because you have these
Really easy.
blobby objects and it defaults to containers. So if you just kind of keep going down, you might end up with 4 levels deep or 6 levels deep and you don't even realize it. Or if you're like trying to write a getter or a create method for every single part of your hierarchy, you sometimes lose track of how deep you really are. So
yep. So that's layouts is probably the first place to look if you're experiencing performance problems, and seeing how you can thin that out to make it a little leaner. So, and the other awesome layout is the card layout. So a card layout takes an array of items and turns them into a stack of views, a stack of view cards, if you will. And then you can flip between them, flip back and forth, you can animate, transition, all that cool stuff. So that is probably one using quite a bit. A tab panel, as you might imagine, is indeed based on a card layout. And that's generally how you work with those. And then the other thing in views is the items, which I've gone over before, but it's all the child components of the view. However you want to make your view, that's where it all goes, within the items. So here's a simple view example, and this is a list. And pretend these 2 lines are deleted, because they shouldn't be there. So here we are making a tweet list, a list of tweets. And we're extending ext.dataview.list, which is a Sencha built-in component that essentially renders a model in whatever way you choose into a little list box, which you can tap on and scroll through, swipe and pull to refresh, and all that good stuff, however complex you want to make it. And then the important bit with the list is attaching it to a store. So if you have already initialized your store, you can reference it just like this. Otherwise, you can use the fully qualified name, and it will go pull it out, and it will yell at you for loading something asynchronous. Loading something synchronously, you should have predefined that somewhere else, and you'll see a nice little happy warning in your console, and it's good. So we're going to use our tweet store, which we defined earlier, and then this item TPL, that stands for item template, and that is what it will use to render the list item. So you can see there's a couple little things in curly braces, and those are fields from our model, which our store is using. So this is kind of a basically, I'm pulling a field out of your model and using it in the view, just directly. So here's the from user, and then we have the tweet text. So very simple. But you can make that as complex as you want. You can make it fill pages, if that's how you want to do it. You can make your entire UI with item template, actually, if you wanted to. You could just, put giant blocks of HTML and manipulate them, just make a giant HTML template and fill it up with whatever the heck you want. So you don't have to use, you could use nothing but templates and instead of any of the Sencha UI widgets, and that's how some people make mobile apps, and you can make them really, really performant that way. So that is a valid approach.
just the templating engine. There's 2 different kinds of templates. I'm pretty sure it's still essentially attached to X template and regular. Or does it just have X template?
It all becomes X template in the end.
Okay, so in the end,
In
right?
the end.
Right,
Well,
but the point is, it has additional capabilities. It has conditional processing, and it has functions you can build in, and you can do all kinds of crazy junk in the
loops
template.
And,
Loops can do all kinds of stuff.
could I actually, in
Control
theory,
flow
put a
logic.
template into a different file?
Sorry?
Yes,
So I could reference a file instead of inline string.
yes. If you use a require statement and pull it in, you could.
Yep, you can do all that. I don't think you could.
You can use a DOM. You can use a script tag in the DOM and goopy retrieve it that way.
Script template.
Yeah, you could just retrieve the string. It's just a string that goes to that property.
Exactly.
So as long as you get a string to the property somehow, you're
Yep.
fine. So however you want to do that, You want to type it in, you want to retrieve it from the DOM, you want to get a file from somewhere. You have to get a file the other way that
Yeah,
requires.
you could define HTML templates and
Right.
read them in as a string, and then attach that to the
Right.
item TPL object that would be used. It would be
Maybe
good.
real crazy. You could make a store and pull them in, and then you could read the data out of the store.
I don't know if we want to go.
I mean, you could
insane.
Ajax pull. You could grab them from the servers.
Right.
As complex as you want it to be, it's all you. So, controllers. Controllers handle application level logic, things that span multiple things. And there's two very important things that are special about controllers. The first thing is the refs property. So these are references to view elements. So basically, the refs, a ref will take a name, which is what you want to call the reference, and then that will automatically create a getter and the setter within the controller. So if you made a reference to my tweet list, which I'll show you, it'll create a getter and a setter called getTweetList and all that good stuff. But this is a direct reference to view elements. So Sencha works a little bit backwards from other MVC frameworks, is that the controllers attach to the views, and the views, instead of the views attaching to the controllers. So, but generally speaking, that is the Sencha way. And unfortunately, there's really no other way to do it, unless you want to get super crazy event heavy, which you can do. So, use these whenever you need to access a view element of any kind. So if you need to pull data off of a form, you get a reference to the form and then pull its data off, and then there you go. And then control, the control property is view element event listeners. So this it's basically shortcut syntax to hook into a specific event of any view element. So for example, a button has a tap event, which is definitely a useful event, and you hook into that from a controller, and then it will call a whatever method you specify on the button tap. So, and you can use that for just about any element. There's at least a dozen distinct events that you probably end up using on a day-to-day basis if you work with Sencha Touch, because it loves events, because events are great. Alright, and I don't think anyone can see that. But right here we have our refs object, and it's called TweetList. We have the property here, and then that looks for an element. And this little string here is a selector, so you can reference by ID or whatever else fits the ext component query syntax. So they have their own querying model, which is documented, and you can do all kinds of crazy things like you'd be able to do with jQuery selectors or anything like that. And I'll do it here, except it might be slightly different. But here, since we just have a bare string, it defaults to searching by X type. So that's good, as long as you only have one of that X type coming back, or else you're going to have a bad time if you have more than one. So we only have one tweet list, so we'll just reference it by X type. And then here, the control, we are hooking into the item tap event of our tweet list, and we'll use that later. And then down here we have the launch function, which is similar to the application launch function, except it happens whenever this controller is first activated. So when something references this controller and pulls it into memory, this launch function is called. And in this case, we are going to load our store full of tweets. And this right here, stores have a load method, and that's pretty much the most useful thing about stores, is you call load on them, and then it will use its proxy that you've defined in order to get data from somewhere and fill itself up with delicious, delicious data. And then down here, so up here in the control, we define our item tab event that we want to hook into, and this string is the method that we want to call once that happens. So that's called onTweetTap, and defined right down here is onTweetTap. And basically what that does is pop up a box and show that one in the live demo. So Proxies are the final bit in the Sencha oligarchy of stuff. So proxies, they fill a store with either local or remote data. They can read a whole bunch of data types, and by a whole bunch, I mean XML and JSON, pretty much.
Or anything else you want to write yourself.
Or anything else you want to write yourself. You can write your own readers and whatever you want to do.
YAML?
Yeah. No, I don't think it does YAML out of the box, but you could write a YAML reader really easily.
Yeah.
So the way it supports getting them in just about every popular way. So you've got Ajax/REST support. And the only difference is that so it comes with, so this would be the Ajax send ext.ajax proxy and ext REST proxy, they're called. But the only difference is that the REST proxy has pre-configured RESTy actions. So when you do a RESTful thing, it will use the appropriate HTTP method in good RESTful manner. You can configure Ajax proxy to do that, but the REST proxy has already done it for you.
Also has a URL generator.
Also does have that. And then also supports JSON-P. Is anyone familiar with JSON-P? Alright, so JSON-P means JSON with padding. It's basically a giant hack to make cross-domain requests without actually making cross-domain requests. So how JSON-P actually works is that instead of requesting something directly from a website via XML HTTP request, it will insert a script tag into the DOM with the URL of whatever thing you want. So the script tag is allowed to make cross-domain requests, unlike the XML HTTP request object. So when the page is rendered, the script tag goes out, gets your thing, and whatever data you want will come back wrapped in a JavaScript function, which will be immediately executed by the JSON-P wrapper thingy.
With an eval.
Yep.
With an eval.
With an eval. So
all security people hate this because it's terrible.
Like I said, it's a giant, it's a giant ridiculous hack, but it's a great way to do.
Isn't there like a JSON eval thing?
Yeah, but you have to eval the string that comes back to.
Yeah, so basically with JSON-P, you send a callback function to the server, it will wrap it in that function for you, and then once you get back, you call that callback function that has now been inserted into your page from the server, and then you get the data. And that's how JSON-P works. A much better solution is CORS, which stands for Cross-Origin Resource Sharing. And basically what this entails is setting up a bunch of headers on the server side so it will allow you to make cross-domain requests via Ajax as you normally would, instead of using this ridiculous, insecure JSON-P hack.
So you shouldn't use JSON-P. And actually, I think some of the newer, I think it's Chrome or somebody's new builds they have the security sandbox model thing that it disallows dynamic script tag insertion into the DOM.
See, that doesn't surprise me because that is a ludicrous security.
Yeah, it's a terrible idea. So there are newer. I don't remember what it is exactly, but it's either new browser build or new mobile builds. They have this security sandboxing thing that says it'll throw an error and say security violation. You can't inject script tags because that's the best way to make a cross-domain. To make all kinds of horrible problems is by injecting script tags in the DOM. So.
That's how pretty much every cross-site scripting attack ends up working. It's by injecting a script tag, or by some other way executing code on the page.
CORS, is that like just proxying through the server and the server makes the request?
No, it's not proxying. CORS is a direct communication between your format and the server. So basically,
not the origin server would be third-party server.
What?
Like third-party server?
Yes, third-party server. The third-party server has to specifically allow you to make requests specified in the headers, which it will send back. So you will make.
What's the HTML standard?
It's a standard, but yes, CORS is standard, and but it's really great once you get it working, because
once you get it working,
everything has to line up exactly correctly. So if you have so basically your app will send a few specific headers, and then the server will send a few specific headers back in response. So they need to tell you XML HTTP requests can make requests anywhere. It just requires the server to tell it it's okay.
Yeah.
So that's what the server is doing. It's telling it's okay. It's okay. They can talk to me. It's all right. And that's what CORS defines.
Gotcha.
So that's a whole. Sorry, Stan.
Yeah.
So that's a whole freaking talk in itself.
That's actually very cool.
But it's definitely the cross origin of choice if you control both the client and the server.
Yeah.
So,
Or if the server is friendly.
or if the server is friendly.
Or you can write a proxy.
Or you can
Or
write a
get
proxy.
Yeah.
Proxying is generally the best approach if you don't control the back end.
Yeah.
Yes, Walter.
Does I have a JSON-P that uses an image tag instead?
You know,
You can use that
I
for
don't-
other things,
I don't
but
think that
not
would
for
work.
JSON-P.
Why? You can totally read the data out of my image
You
tag.
could if you
Just
really
might be
wanted.
basic support.
Yeah, you could.
Well, yeah,
You
you gotta
I suppose you
parse
could do
the
that.
image.
There's actually a whole pattern called semaphoring that like uses the slave image tag.
Neat.
Man,
Sorry, go
ancient
on.
web dev. Love it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, old web dev apps are just the worst. Oh my god. Anyway, so to proxies, you can attach a reader object, which by default can read pretty much XML or JSON. And there's basically one important thing you can do to the reader, and that's tell it which property your data lives in. So there's a root property configuration, which you can pass a path, basically. So however deeply the data you want is nested within the data you get back from the server, you can tell it, read this bit. And then we'll go read that bit and try to stuff it into models and all that good stuff. Proxies can also cookie authenticate in Sencha Touch, which is a great feature. If you've already used that on your server backend, you can just kind of reuse that. There's a few considerations with CORS regarding cookies, and you'll have to do some tweakiness on the back end. Specifically, you cannot wildcard. If you are sending cookies, you cannot wildcard the access control allow origin headers. So when the server sends that back, it has to be specifically you. It cannot be a wildcard if you are sending cookies. But anyway, so the with credentials property, you can set that to either true or false, and that will send a cookie if available, or set the cookie if a server provides one. So that's another important thing. If you are using cookies, then whatever proxy makes your login request that gets you the initial cookie back needs to have this set to true, because or else it will not be allowed to write the cookie, and you will just kind of not have any cookies. So anything that deals with cookies in any way gets with credentials true. And then there's another option which you might need to get rid of for CORS, and that's use default XHR header. And that means use default cross-host request header. And what that is the X requested by header, and by default that is set to JavaScript or something. But the important thing is that triggers a lot of CORS nonsense that you can generally avoid. So if you can turn off that header, it generally makes life a lot easier with CORS. But generally speaking, we'll leave that on because it is in fact a security feature, whether you like it or not. So,
Very good.
one more time. Yeah. Here we go. So here's our proxy. So this is actually a JSON-P proxy because that is what the Twitter search API uses. Because I can't imagine setting up CORS for a service the size of Twitter. Jesus Christ, that's weird. So we are extending ext.data.proxy.jsonp, and that is our JSONP base class, and we are aliasing this as proxy.twitter. Now, alias is a little bit different from xtype because you can do a lot more with it, such as specifying a pseudo namespace kind of thing. So since we say proxy here, the alias knows that it's a proxy, and we'll be able to, if you remember in my proxy definition in the store, it just said tweet proxy. It just said Twitter. So since we specified this alias as proxy.twitter, it knows that it automatically registers that as a alternate proxy type. So you can use it just straight up as Twitter. So
You can do widget dot, you can do
widget dot,
proxy dot.
proxy dot. There's all this kind of secret, not quite documented stuff that is actually quite useful. And so, the most important part of your proxy is the URL. So in this case, we are search.twitter.com/search.json. And then the other important bit is the extra params configuration. Basically, this is any kind of parameters that you want to send along with the request, which will be URL encoded and all that good stuff automatically. And you just kind of make a map. And they'll be shoved into your URL and sent up away to the server. So here, these are a couple things that the Twitter API wants, such as result type, language, and queue, which is the query. So here we're just searching for Sencha, which will return a bunch of and what these parameters end up doing is returning a bunch of popular tweets regarding Sencha. And then our reader is defined here. The type is JSON, obviously, because this is a JSON-P proxy. If you're getting back something that's not JSON, that's probably bad. And the root property, as defined in the astoundingly complex response you get from Twitter, is results. That's what you want. So in summary, models, structure, store collections of models. Controllers, pretty much everything that interacts, any app interaction within itself, and pretty much everything else. Views, present data, and proxies, get data from somewhere else. So now we're going to talk about the greatest tool in the universe, which is SAS. So SAS stands for Syntactically Awesome Style Sheets. And if you've ever worked with CSS, you know it's complete freaking garbage. You can do nothing with CSS as a programmer. So
You can type.
You can type characters, and you can copy, and you can paste, and that's what you can do. It's just the worst. It's absolutely awful. However, this SAS takes all that pain away and turns it into a glorious pseudo-programming language
You can have variables.
that has variables and mix-ins and inheritance and built-in minification tools, and it's just, yes, nesting, and it's all freaking outstanding. So if you ever worked in CSS and hated it, this will change your opinion immediately. It's like, why do I have to copy and paste this color everywhere? Can't I just put it somewhere? And the answer with CSS is no. Eat a dick. And the answer is yes. Absolutely, you may put that in a variable wherever you want. I don't care. So
You can include multiple files.
yeah, you can. Yeah, see, there's you can. I'll get into. You can include partial SASs, which I have an example of, which I'll show you because it's the best thing ever. And then SAS is built with a tool called Compass. You can build a SAS, but Compass has a few extra features, and it's generally nicer, and that's what Sencha wants you to have. So if you're working Sencha, you want Compass. So there's two commands you really have to care about with Compass, and that's Compass compile, and that's just a one-shot compile. You'll take your SAS definition and look at a file called config.rb, which basically has metadata for where it's supposed to find stuff when it wants to go compile your SAS. And then it looks for config.rb in the current directory and will yell at you if it does not find it. So wherever you are, run this command from a command prompt in the proper directory and everything will be good. And then there's my favorite, Compass Watch. So that will just kind of toss that in a terminal, and it will watch a directory for any time your SAS or any of its dependencies changes. So if you have one SCSS file which includes 40 other ones, it will watch all of them, and every time you change anything in any of them, then it will be like, boom, gonna recompile that for you, dude, no problem. Just give me like 3 seconds, you'll be able to look at your shiny new changes.
Yes.
And it's absolutely outstanding. So, oops.
One more thing about SAS and Compass. You can use JRuby if you don't have.
Got my slides out of order.
Yeah.
That's okay.
JRuby and
SAS partials. So, SAS lets you import things, and it does that with what it calls partials, which are partial CSS definitions, as you might gather. So allows you to logically divide your CSS in whatever manner you see fit. I generally like to divide by view because that's a nice, good container to have CSS segmented by. And Sass partials, they are files that start with an underscore and end in .scss. Or it's just CSS with an S on the front. And then so underscore home.scss. And to actually use that, use the @import statement, which is a Sass construct, and that will, and you pass that a file name, or you pass that a path, which ends in a file name, and that will import your happy little partial and compile it into the big glom of CSS which you will eventually have. So in this project, I've had an example of that, and so we've created over here in the Sass folder. So we notice our app.scss is right here, and there's a folder in which I put underscore home.css. You can have as many folders as you want because you can pass any arbitrary path to this import statement. So organize to your heart's desire. But so this will look in the st2 demo folder for a file named underscore home.scss. And so it'll just kind of infer that the home at the end here is a Sass partial, which is generally how you want to keep it. So, and there it is. So once you compile Compass from this directory, it will go through and pull this thing out and pull it back in, and everything will be good. And then just one more thing about Sencha events. So Sencha events you can do are pretty much outstanding. Use them for any kind of cross-component communication, and you can do them at pretty much any scope you want. You can do them at the level of the entire application. So you can fire an event to the entire application, like login was successful. Everyone do what you got to go do. And then with the whatever called the login code doesn't have to care anymore, and everything else can happen as it happens. So from a controller, controllers have a nice convenience method called getApplication, which will get a reference to your application. Then you call the fireEvent method on it. So fireEvent, you can do two things. There are two arguments at minimum. Well, there's one argument minimum. There's, I think, 4 or 5. You only really have to care about 2. And the first argument is the event name. So obviously that's whatever event you want to call it. So for example, login successful. That can be the name of an event. And you can pass data along to that event in the form of JSON, basically. So, or JavaScript object, because that's what JSON is. It's just JavaScript objects. So right now we have a property called data1, and that has a kitten string next to it. So so this method call here fires an event called event name, and then whoever receives that event will get this data.